It's my nerd world. Welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice, a Star Wars podcast. This week on the show, more details from the Rise of Skywalker novel. That's right, a lot of information has been leaking out prior to the novel's official release, and I have a lot of additions to the story of the Rise of Skywalker to share with you, including how in the Sam heck did Rey fly Luke's X-Wing, which is a dream come true for me, off of Ahch-To when he used the wing as a door. The novel tells us. So we'll get into that. Also, Star Wars storytelling in the modern era of cinema. Watching Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame, and just a few thoughts popped into my head about the way those movies are crafted and the potential impact that those movies may have had on the public's perception of the Rise of Skywalker. And inspired by the Knights of Vader, even though I haven't listened to the show just yet, I know that Zach is doing a rewatch of The Mandalorian and sharing his thoughts. And again, I haven't listened yet, but I started doing the same thing. So we'll kick off the show talking a little bit about The Mandalorian before we get into all the Rise of Skywalker novel tidbits. So let's go ahead and make it official, shall we? Glad you're with the show this week.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
I don't know if I've talked about this on the show, but the lightsaber fight, the final great duel, right? The lightsaber fight on the Death Star 2 in the Rise of Skywalker. I love the lightsaber fight, right? Just in and of itself, it's fantastic. Another one of the highlights of the Rise of Skywalker for me, and a nice juxtaposition to the epic battle that we got in Revenge of the Sith, right? Being surrounded by lava on Mustafar, and here being surrounded by water on Kef Bir and the Death Star 2. There's just some really great moments in that fight. I really do. That fight is really, really exciting for me. But I love the addition of the Force block that takes place by both Kylo Ren and Rey when they force shove the lightsaber back, and you can actually see the blade of the saber dissipating a bit, like moving backwards. Really, really cool. Same thing at the end of the Rise of Skywalker on Exegol, when Rey takes out the Red Guards of Palpatine, and she's actually stopping laser blasts in midair and throwing them back at those guards. Some not leaked footage, but Disney and Lucasfilm released a whole bunch of clips this past week for the Rise of Skywalker. Might have been, I think it was this past week. I don't think we talked about it on last week's show. I don't know. The weeks are kind of blurring together. But they released just a bunch of clips of some of the key moments in the film, and including a big portion of the end of the film. And in those clips, many people, including myself, were able to freeze frame those Red Guards because you never really got a good look at them in the movie. And this is a part of the show that we'll spend some time on today, sort of the decisions that J.J. Abrams made to do certain things on film and not do other things on film, and the level of ambiguity that it lended to the movie in and of itself. But you can finally get a decent look at those guards, and they're kind of across. I thought that they had they're the red of the Sith troopers. The helmets in the back are a little bit more Vader-esque. They kind of fan out. But the face of those guards is kind of a combination of a First Order jet trooper and tanker troopers that we've seen previously. It has sort of the elongated chin, and it's flat. They look really rad. It's just they're a very interesting design, and I'm curious to see if they pop up in the art book that's coming out with the movie at the end of the at the end of the month. I'd like to see some concept art or some official artwork of that, because they were not in the extensive visual dictionary, because that visual dictionary is really good, but it doesn't include those troopers in it. I love all of the Sith trooper design and aesthetic. Even some of the officers on board the Star Destroyers, they have the red helmets, the long red helmets with the backs that flange out with the black face mask. They are included in the visual dictionary. Remind me a lot of the helmet that you see at the beginning of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Before Dracul becomes Dracula, at the beginning of the movie, he's got Gary Oldman's got this. Has this really interesting and unique red armor on at the actually it's very evocative of the Praetorian Guards, to be honest with you, but he's got this ribbed armor on, and the helmet that he wears reminded me a lot of, or I should say that those helmets in the Rise of Skywalker reminded me a lot of that armor at the end of, or at the beginning of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, all right, I don't want to get too far off topic. We got a lot to cover on today's show. Like I said in the preview, I got a lot of tidbits coming out of the Rise of Skywalker novel. Also, there's an article from Collider, a podcast that I'm not listening to anymore because they completely changed things up, and there's no more Star Wars content or anything. Kind of sucks. But Collider does have an article, Adam Chitwood does, talking with Neil Scanlon, the creature designer on The Rise of Skywalker, and he gets into the Eye of Webbish Bog scene. This was the scene of Kylo Ren at the beginning of the film on Mustafar talking to the Oracle that was in one of the leaks, and so we'll get into that here in just a few minutes. Do want to take just a moment and talk a little bit about revisiting The Mandalorian. The Knights of Vader podcast, as I mentioned, I know are doing that this week. I'm going to be listening to that podcast actually here in a bit when I take my my beloved dog Bella for a walk when I'm done with the podcast. But it kind of inspired me to go back and watch the episodes again. Now, I've seen each one of the Mandalorian episodes at least 3 times, if not 4. The final episode in the season that Taika Waititi directed is my favorite of the entire series. But I decided to go back and rewatch it from the beginning now that I've had a couple of months distance on it and haven't watched it in a while, and was looking for some new Star Wars to watch, and that's why we have the Disney streaming service. And I'll tell you, I really like The Mandalorian from the get-go. There's no doubt about that. I didn't probably match the same level of hype that a lot of people had for it. I love how nostalgic the show is. I love how the pacing is very much reminiscent of the original trilogy and certainly Star Wars. But I like the larger saga tales. I like the larger scope, things that we're getting deep into the Force and the mythology. So that's more of what I gravitate towards when it comes to my Star Wars watching and what I enjoy the most. Now, this might be because of what I'm doing currently, because right now, as book 3 in my EMBARK series continues to be edited, I am working on a side story, which will involve one of the characters from my EMBARK series. And so this story in and of itself it has some similarities to The Mandalorian, but not a lot. This side story that I'm writing is a much more intimate story with just a couple of characters as opposed to the larger EMBARK stories that I've been telling. So I might be a little biased in watching The Mandalorian and having a newfound appreciation for it because of this particular story that I'm writing right now. I just wanted to put that out there because that's not to say my opinion of the show has really changed all that much, but it is to say that going back and watching it again, I find myself enjoying it in a way that I didn't before. and in a good way. So again, going back and rewatching The Mandalorian has been a really fun experience, and because of this rewatch, I think I'll probably be watching it more often. When it first came out, I really was kind of hoping for, even though I knew I wasn't going to get it, and I've mentioned this on the show, I was kind of hoping for something a little bit more grand in scale, something a little bit more towards Game of Thrones, where we have, a lot of different characters and a detailed plot and sort of a larger, grander scope story. And that certainly isn't what The Mandalorian is. And I actually wanted episodes that were a little bit longer, but now going back and watching it, I actually kind of like the fact that the episodes are shorter. And the pacing of it is a lot different now than I had remembered just a couple of months ago. I was going back in watching it thinking it was going to be slower than it was. It actually moves at a pretty good clip. So, again, my revisit of The Mandalorian has actually made me appreciate the show more, and finding out a little bit more of the background of how the show in and of itself is actually made has provided another sort of level of interest for me beyond what I had prior watching it when all the episodes were first released. So, as always, if you want to be part of the listener feedback show and comment on this, I'd be curious to get your thoughts now that we've had some distance from The Mandalorian on The Mandalorian. So email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on YouTube if you are listening to this on YouTube.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
Yeah, this is kind of leaks as we shift gears. We got a bunch of Rise of Skywalker novelization stuff to get into, and more specifically, things that weren't seen in the Rise of Skywalker. So I have some more pages to actually read, more snippets from the end of the film, also some details on Palpatine actually creating his son as a clone, but a failed clone. So we'll get into a little bit more of that. And again, I think I talked about that a bit on last week's show, but we're going to cover that ground again and then go through the list of what one particular podcast said about the novelization. I basically have a bullet point list of things that were in the book that weren't in the movie. But let's start here with this Collider.com article from Adam Chitwood. Rise of Skywalker, the Eye of a Webbish Bog scene was filmed. Here's why it was cut. So fans who have been poring over the concept art and images from scenes that didn't make it into The Rise of Skywalker will be heartened to hear one crucial Kylo Ren scene was in fact filmed. Images teasing an incredibly cool-looking creature called the Eye of a Webbish Bog have been making the rounds over the last few months, but the character does not appear in the final cut of The Rise of Skywalker. The character supposedly pointed Kylo Ren in the direction of Darth Vader's Wayfinder when he was confronted on Mustafar. You recall in the opening moments of The Rise of Skywalker, Kylo Ren mows down Sith cultists to find Vader's Wayfinder himself. There is indeed an extra step in which Kylo conversed with this spider-like creature, and Rise of Skywalker creature and makeup effects supervisor Neil Scanlon confirmed the scene was shot when I spoke to him over the phone for an interview with Collider. While we'll be running our full interview closer to the March 17th HD release date on digital of The Rise of Skywalker, we figured what Scanlon had to say about the Eye of a Webbish Bog scene was too interesting to wait. Scanlon described the concept and the execution of creating this particular creature and revealed that they shot the scene on location in a real lake. That was a character that was designed very early on in the day. Jake Lunt Davies, who was one of my concept designers, we were all playing around with this idea and talking about it, and he did this drawing, and JJ saw it and went, "That is amazing." It was one of those moments where it was like, this has to be in the movie. So we actually did build it, and we took it to a place called Black Park in the UK, which is close to Pinewood Studios, where we shot it on in a lake on location. That sequence exists. Unfortunately, it didn't make it into the movie story plot-wise, etc. It was a fully practical character shot on location, and it was amazing. So here's how it was described in the novelization. A giant emerged, a hairless creature sheening with wetness, bits of lake detritus clinging to its pasty skin. Its eyes were squeezed shut, but it could still see after a fashion, because draped over its massive bald head and across one shoulder was a second creature with long, spidery tentacles. The two were locked in symbiosis. Kylo sensed the giant's pain, as though it were a slave to the spidery being that clung to it. Yet, neither could it survive alone. Now, we don't have any indication that the scene's going to be released on any of the upcoming video releases. There's no Blu-ray scenes listed as of yet. Scanlan holds out hope the character could be revived for the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian. I hope that we can maybe bring that back in some way, shape, or form on the TV series The Mandalorian, or that we can revisit the character in some way, because it was a haunting image and a very unusual image, but one which I think is incredibly Star Wars. So, yeah, somewhere there's footage of that. As for why the scene was cut, Scanlan says it has to do with runtime, an issue he's constantly considering when designing any creature. Apparently, Abrams found a quicker way for the same information to be relayed to the audience. I think maybe it was too lengthy an explanation for something that Abrams was able to explain in the movie much quicker, eventually. JJ's movies move very quickly, don't they? And it was all part of Kylo Ren's journey. And I think he just felt that there was too much time being spent on something which he explained much quicker. So that's all it was, really. Runtime is always the biggest fear of any movie. So much of what we do, so much of what we shoot, and I'm sure this is the same for every department. You invest so much time and love in it, and you hope it'll make the final cut. But it doesn't always do that, because the movie would be 4 hours long, which would be great, and then everybody laughs. The article wraps up with this. I do sincerely hope we'll see this scene in full someday, because the brief glimpses we've seen, and from Scanlan's description, he sounds incredibly cool. I do not envy anybody that goes and creates these films and then has to decide what stays and what goes and what gets covered and what doesn't get covered. I can only imagine how frustrating and difficult a process that must be. Again, I can only relate to kind of what I do when writing my science fiction stories, but I have a luxury because I'm writing novels, and with novels, you can afford to put a bunch of stuff in there that wouldn't necessarily be in what I would dream one day would be a movie version of my stories. And so, if you were to go and ask me, hey, John, do you think they should have left that in? I'm probably going to say, yeah, sure. Why not? I'm sure it was a short scene. Maybe it would have slowed down the beginning sequence a little bit so we can spend a little bit more time with it. But at the same time, when you're looking at a movie that's 2 hours and 20 minutes long, that has a lot of ground to cover, and I'm incredibly happy with everything else they left in, I'm totally okay with them deciding not to go and include this scene, because I personally really like the product that we got. Let's work under the assumption for a moment that the Rise of Skywalker couldn't be any longer than what it was. So as we work through these other items that are in the book and not the movie, and we look at it or discuss it or think about it through the lens of, well, what would you have taken out in order to add this stuff in? And I can't think of anything. As I go through the list here, I suppose you can make little mentions here or there and spend a little bit more time in dialogue, but I truly love this movie and the way that it plays out and the length that it is. And so there isn't anything in the film that I can go, well, you could cut that shorter, you could cut that shorter, because I personally find the pacing of the whole film to be pretty spot on. Even the beginning now, after watching it as many times as I've watched it, I really like the opening montage. We get off to this fast start. We are introduced back to Palpatine, and we run through the scenario. We get this really fun sequence, which is a really fun. That opening sequence with Claude and Poe and Finn on the mining planet and the light speed skipping, that sequence is fantastic. And then leading right into Rey at the beginning in her training montage. So, again, if they had included it, I think you could have added a few minutes to the film at the beginning and fleshed that out a little bit more and maybe established more that Kylo Ren was on Mustafar at the start. But at the same time, it's not necessary to convey the information that the audience needs to know. I can understand why JJ was like, look, he's going to get a Wayfinder. We're going to explain the Wayfinder. We just need to show him getting the Wayfinder, and that's how he found Palpatine on Exegol, and that gets achieved in a really, really good way, in my opinion, at the beginning of the movie.
Something inside of me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
All right, so let's get into these Rise of Skywalker novel excerpts and details. Now, there's going to be a little bit of overlap on some of this stuff. So some of the stuff I'm reading from the Ray Carson novel pages, Ray Carson novel pages I have in front of me, are going to be repeated in the bullet point list. But there's a lot of ground to cover here, so let's dive into it. So first off, we have a couple of pages here towards the end of the book and the end of the story. And this would be Rey on Exegol and her confronting Palpatine and getting into a little bit more details and background about how Palpatine was able to survive on the Death Star 2 from Return of the Jedi. So at this point, Palpatine has made the offer to have her strike him down in order for the two of them to become one. So she will take her revenge, Palpatine boomed. Rey continued to approach. His power was intoxicating. She found herself raising her weapon almost against her will, if not for the other presence in her mind. Bright and shining with light, she would not be able to resist him. And, with the stroke of her saber, the Sith are reborn. The Jedi are dead. Wave after wave of triumph emanated from him. Along with it came knowledge, memories. Maybe it was their shared blood that enabled her to see his thoughts. But somehow she could. And Rey saw it then, how he'd done it, what he was about to do again. Falling, down a massive shaft, the betrayed, sharp, and stinging, a figure high above, black-clad and helmeted and shrinking fast. His very own apprentice had turned on him. The way he had found himself turned against Plagueis, whose secret was immortality he had stolen. Plagueis had not acted fast enough in his own moment of death, but Sidious, sensing the flickering light in his apprentice, had been ready for years. So the dying emperor called on all the dark power of the Force to thrust his consciousness far, far away, to a secret place he had been preparing. His body was dead, an empty vessel, long before it hit the bottom of the shaft. And his mind jolted to a new awareness in a new body, a painful one, a temporary one. It was too soon. The secret place had not completed its preparations. The transfer was imperfect, and the clone body wasn't enough. Perhaps Plagueis was having the last laugh after all. Maybe his secret remained secret because Palpatine was trapped in a broken, dying form. The heretics of the Sith Eternal toiled, splicing genes, bolstering tissue, creating unnatural abominations in hopes that one of those strand casts would succeed and become a worthy receptacle. The heretics would do anything, risk anything, sacrifice anything to create a cradle for their God consciousness. And then we also get into this, which is the next part of this particular passage, and it gets into Palpatine's son. Nothing worked, but their efforts were not certainly in vain. One genetic strand cast lived, thrived even, a not quite identical clone, his son. But he was useless, a powerless failure. Palpatine could not even bear to look upon such disappointing ordinariness. The boy's only worth would lay in continuing the bloodline through more natural methods. And so I had a question on listener feedback that I didn't get a chance to get to this week. But they asked a question about why would Palpatine go and keep a failed clone as his son, and that passage answers that question. Palpatine had every intention of using his failed clone copy as a means to go and continue his bloodline, which certainly ended up taking place, in Rey. And again, I'm totally fine that we're getting more details of this in the novel and that we didn't get it in the movie. I don't know in what way, shape, or form, without sitting down and having a massive, sort of conversation of exposition within the film, where you're able to go and convey all of this information and details. And I think it's also needed to note that that's not how J.J. Abrams goes and does his movies. I mean, George Lucas has, right? George Lucas did, and to a certain extent Rian Johnson did, with some success. I would say that Rian Johnson did it with more success than George Lucas did in the prequel trilogy, but J.J. Abrams tends to make movies that are way more fast-paced than that, and it keeps moving, and if there's an opportunity there to let the audience go and extrapolate rather than lay it out completely and even leave some of that Star Wars ambiguity that I talk about so often, J.J. Abrams goes and takes advantage of that. And I think that for a lot of people, it really comes down to what do you enjoy more in your entertainment, whether it's movies or music, right, or television shows. How do you like your content presented to you? I know there are a lot of people that like to have things more spelled out. My wife is that way. I can watch a film without her and know that there's not going to be a resolution at the end, and I will warn her going into it and say, hey, look, I know you're going to really like this movie, but I'm just going to let you know that they're not really going to give you a completely closed ending. They're going to leave it up to the imagination. Inception's a really good example of that, right? I'm not that way. I'm totally fine with leaving some stuff on the table, from leaving this desire to want more, or to, think about certain things beyond the film that may not have been answered directly, and even getting those answers later on. And if I don't get those answers later on, I'm fine. And I'm the same way when it comes to my music listening, too. Depeche Mode's music, which is my favorite band, I also do a podcast for them. Their music oftentimes has a lot of ambiguity to it, but there's a relatability to a lot of their songs. And I think for a lot of people, they're not really fans of that particular music, and I imagine those individuals are also not fans of that type of storytelling. I'll take both. And, what J.J. Abrams does in his storytelling, I really, really like. I love the 2 Star Trek movies he did. And I like Star Trek Beyond, too, but I know a lot of people don't like Into Darkness, and I absolutely love that film. Both the 2010 sort of reboot, doing that thing with my fingers of Star Trek, and Star Trek Into Darkness, those are almost like Star Wars movies for me. I mean, they certainly don't act like old Star Trek movies, right? And J.J. Abrams even said he paced those more like Star Wars films. And so, if I've watched a bunch of Star Wars, but yet I'm in the mood for more Star Wars, but I don't feel like going and watching the thing that I just watched, I'll throw in one of J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies, for crying out loud. All right, we have more excerpts from the book and details. The Unknown Regions podcast laid out in one of their recent shows a whole bunch of stuff, and somebody on Reddit was kind enough to go and sort of bullet point all the things that they pointed out that weren't in the movie but were in the book. So let's run through this list here. So after Palpatine realizes that Ben and Rey are a dyad, I love that concept, by the way. I really hope that that's something that comes into play later on down the road. I always like the concept of the rule of 2, and I think that there's a lot that can be done with that if we end up doing movies, not books, but movies prior to The Phantom Menace. But this introduction of the dyad, I really, really dig that idea of the connection between these 2 particular individuals that are strong with the Force and what they are able to do with it. And I really hope that that is something that, content creators in the future go and grab onto. So after Palpatine realizes that Rey and Ben are a dyad, he reminisces about the time that he wanted to create a dyad between himself and Anakin. Darth Plagueis also wanted a dyad between himself and Palpatine. This is because the power of the dyad is just so powerful. More so than the rule of 2 concept. Except Palpatine and Plagueis obviously failed. Ben and Rey's dyad is referred to as their power. Leia doesn't want to make the same mistake with Rey she did with Ben, so that's why she wouldn't send her away. And that's why we got the scene in the movie where Rey wants to go and Leia says no. Kylo says he wants to rule side by side with Rey when Palpatine orders him to kill her. Kylo had no intention of killing Rey. Kylo reconstructs his helmet because it's a Knights of Ren tradition or something to wear the helmet. Kylo has to scavenge the pieces. And according to the Jedi Paxis leaks, that was supposed to be a longer scene, but it was cut down and a lot of the exposition was removed. And again, totally fine with that. If they had included something a little bit further to explain why Kylo Ren put the helmet back on, I would have been cool with that. But honestly, if we were going to spend time sort of filling in little gaps like that, I would have rather the film filled in the gap of Like, say, how did Kylo Ren survive Rey force flipping over his TIE Whisper on Pisana when it exploded? I am doing my own headcanon version of that, and Kylo Ren was strapped into the cockpit of his TIE Whisper so that when he spun, it didn't hurt him. As a NASCAR fan, if you watch the Daytona 500, Ryan Newman suffered this horrific crash to which a lot of people thought that he was probably dead, and he wasn't. Actually walked out of the hospital a few days later. I take that canon and I apply it to Star Wars and can only imagine through the Force, and with proper restraints inside the TIE Whisper, Kylo Ren could have survived the flipping of the cockpit of the TIE Whisper. The explosion, however, I am also doing my own headcanon, and I'm just going to imagine that a piece of the engine flew off and exploded outside the capsule, and that's why he was fine. I wonder if the book explains it. It's not on the list. That would be an interesting one. And I got to thank Zach again on Knights of Vader 2 because he pointed something to me that I'm going to do later on at the end of the episode that I hadn't seen yet. So we'll get to that coming up in a bit. All right, where are we at here? Kylo interrogates Chewie when he's taken captive. Kylo goes into Chewie's mind, and Chewie is throwing memories at him. Han and Chewie when they're young. Han and Leia cuddling baby Ren. Target practice with the blaster. Ben used to call him Uncle Chewie. Lando does have a missing daughter in the book. Lando finds a hollow disc in a secret compartment on the Falcon. The hollow is of Chewie holding baby Ben. Baby Ben is giggling and pulling on his fur. Rose and Rey have a scene. They're clearly good friends and they hug. The reason why Leia's health is deteriorating so quickly is because of when she got blown out into space in The Last Jedi. There was damage done to her body. I kind of always assumed that. Luke is speaking to Leia all throughout the book, telling Leia that it's time to go. She resists the whole book. She thinks about Luke's last effort to save the Resistance on Crate was his ultimate act of hope and sacrifice for Ben. Leia wants to talk to Ben one more time. Leia says something like, I'm Leia Organa Skywalker Solo. She wants Rey to take up her Skywalker legacy, Ben to take up the Solo legacy, and Poe to take up the Organa legacy. And with all her power, she puts in her hope that this is the one last time, that this one last time will bring Ben back, and it does. And I, again, personally feel like that was conveyed very well in the movie, right? Even though it wasn't laid out completely. Rey is already building her own lightsaber, okay, in the book. There is a lot of Reylo in the book. When you get to the kiss, gratitude is used because he brought her back to life. But there's so much more about how they feel about each other, what they think about each other. It feels like a straight-up YA novel. And I spent a lot of time, for those that don't know, there are two different Star Wars weekly shows here on My Nerd World. There is a listener feedback show that comes out at the end of the week, usually on Fridays, and then there is the full show, which is the one you're listening to, that comes out on Saturday or Sunday. On the listener feedback show, a friend of the show, Bonnie, writes in and spending a lot of time talking about that kiss at the end of the movie, which I absolutely adore. And I said this on the listener feedback show, and I'll say it on this show, as a hopeless romantic, and I always have been, that moment, seeing Rey come back to life in Kylo Ren's arms, and the look of pure joy of her staring at him is just incredibly relatable to me as a hopeless romantic. I can only imagine what that moment must have been like for Ben Solo to not only have been able to bring back this person that he cares for so much, dare I say, loves so much, and then to see that look of pure joy on her face when she realizes that she's looking at Ben Solo, and then the way that she moves in for that kiss is just incredible to me. Finn worried about Rey a lot. Says they started their friendship saving each other. Rey says something to the effect of, Finn would have been a great Jedi. The host was paraphrasing at this point in time. And then here's the part that we talked about before, but we'll get into it again. As part of his contingency, Palpatine prepared to clone before being thrown down the shaft. He sensed the flicker of light within Vader. Before his body hit the ground, he learned to project his essence to one of the clones. It was an imperfect clone, Palpatine's son. Rey's father is also a clone. The son is one of the clone projects of Palpatine because they kept trying to make a body for Palps to contain the power. He is not a perfect body clone. Palpatine hated his son for being a failure because he had no Force abilities. Palpatine wanted Rey because she was naturally conceived. And I dig all of that, and what I really like about it is it certainly sheds light on the line of Snoke using a clone army in The Force Awakens. I still feel like the Sith Troopers should have been clones. That would have been a nice callback, but they weren't, and that's okay. But I also like the fact that it does really tie into the prequel trilogy. And I know that's not conveyed to the audience in the film. We do get the Snoke clones, right, in the vats at the beginning of the movie. And I do like the fact that ties in well to especially Attack of the Clones, which is one of my... I love Attack of the Clones, and I mentioned this before. I love that prequel. I know a lot of people don't, but I do. But I love the fact that there are these tie-ins, and as fans, we now have this canon information from the book that we can apply when watching the movies, and I know that I certainly do. Let's see. In the book, they explain a lot more about Force healing. Rey learns it from healing Luke's kyber crystal. Also, it is said that she would have given her whole self just to bring back Kylo after she stabbed him. Ben's thought process during that moment, it all clicks for him from there. He understands that his mom, his dad, and his uncle sacrificed themselves to help him, and that Rey would have done the same if she had to. And that's when he turns or starts to seek redemption. Lando says the First Order specifically targeted the heroes of the rebellion and stole their children. His daughter was taken, and as far as he was aware, she was a stormtrooper. Hinted it could be Janna, but not confirmed. Lando says they also corrupted Han and Leia's son as well. So that's all the notes, and as we get more and the book becomes available to more people, I'm sure there's more items that we'll be sharing on the show. But again, with all of this, what do you think? Email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment on YouTube. I'd love to know your thoughts on sort of the further details that we're getting in the novel itself. And I'll have a little bit more to talk about, to say about that at the end of the show this week, as we get into a bit of a commentary and sort of a weak hot take, a lukewarm take on modern cinema and perhaps the Marvel MCU, and specifically the last two Avengers movies, the impact that they may have had, on the viewing experience for individuals not only seeing The Last Jedi, but also The Rise of Skywalker. So one more here, and again, this comes from Screen Rant, and hat tip to my buddy Zach over at Knights of Vader, because he tweeted this to me, but in the Rise of Skywalker novelization, it provides an explanation for the film's plot hole regarding Luke Skywalker's X-Wing. Now, I mentioned this before. I cried a lot during the Rise of Skywalker, and the moment when I knew that Rey was going to pilot Luke's X-Wing, I really lost it in the film. That was just an incredibly meaningful moment for me as a Star Wars fan. One of my favorite scenes within the original trilogy was Yoda lifting Luke's X-Wing out of the water and putting it on land after Luke failed to do so. The soaring music of Yoda's theme in that moment is just incredible. But being a huge fan of the vehicles in the film and knowing the vehicle's importance, these are also characters to me. The Millennium Falcon and Luke Skywalker's X-Wing specifically is just as important as the Millennium Falcon is to me in these stories. These are the vehicles that, they took to go to these places. And I'm big into automobiles, right? I like NASCAR, but, my car is also my sanctuary. And so I always looked upon the ships like that as well. So I had been bothered why there hadn't been sort of a canon explanation as to how that X-Wing was able to get off Ahch-To. I could buy that it was underwater, but Luke still used the door for his hut, and that is also shown in the Rise of Skywalker. But now we have an explanation. In the movie, Rey returns to Ahch-To after her duel with Kylo Ren on Kef Bir, with the intention of living the rest of her days in isolation on the remote planet. However, after a pep talk from her old master, Luke encourages Rey to fulfill her destiny and defeat Palpatine. The only problem is that when Rey changed her mind, she seemingly had no way off Ahch-To. Upon her arrival, she destroyed Kylo Ren's TIE fighter, rendering the ship useless. Luke came to Rey's aid again, providing her with transportation to Exegol. In a clear callback to The Empire Strikes Back, Luke lifted the X-Wing out of the water so Rey could fly it. The only problem is that it appeared to be to retroactively create a Last Jedi plot hole, right? The X-Wing was underwater, missing a wing. The Rise of Skywalker, now official novelization, Lucasfilm is attempting to explain the perceived plot hole. In the scene where Rey approaches Exegol, Ray Carson provides some additional insight into the X-Wing and why it was flyable despite allegedly being destroyed by Luke. It was old tech, and it had taken some fast thinking and even faster fingers to get it flight worthy. The wing patched with the door to Luke's hut, shield panels scavenged from the TIE wreckage, and a hefty amount of rewiring. What this reveals off-screen is that Rey used her scavenger background to perform some quick repairs on the X-Wing to get it up and running. I do wish they kind of go back and retroactively take one of the wings out on the X-Wing when it rises out of the water. I know they're not going to do that, but be that as it may, I don't care. It doesn't ruin the scene for me. What this reveals off-screen, right, is that she used her scavenging skills. Carson makes a point to write in the passage that the X-Wing is not fully functional in the slightest, adding it might never fly again, not without the help from Rose and her parts requisite channels. So, whatever Rey did, it was the bare minimum to just get the ship off the ground. This definitely helped smooth over any concerns viewers initially had with the Rise of Skywalker scene. From what can be garnered in the novelization, Luke did indeed destroy his ship, and it had to be fixed before it could fly again. The novelization's timeline is still a bit murky when compared to the movie. Rey apparently stays on Ahch-To overnight before embarking to Exegol, so this may also explain why Luke didn't fly the X-Wing to Crate in The Last Jedi. He didn't have the resources or the time to repair the ship, so he had no choice but to force project himself across the galaxy. One of the more common critiques, the article goes on to say, of The Rise of Skywalker is the film comes across as rushed and isn't entirely thought out. So again, they get into Palpatine, they get into the X-Wing, the X-Wing scene that we just got done talking about. The film makes it seem as if the X-Wing was ready for flight all along, which is why some took issue with the scene. An argument can be made the movie almost definitely would have improved if this bit was included. Pausing the story, though, to show Rey doing some speedy repairs might have slowed down the momentum, but it would have cleared up what audience perceived was a gaping plot hole. It's at this point, though, I think I need to do my little speech again about how it ain't just about us, right? We are the hardcore fans who listen to podcasts or do podcasts like this. The overall casual movie-going audience, the bulk of the money that they make doesn't care about these things. So what I think it comes down to is trying to find the right balance, right? And perhaps if I were going to suggest anything, or if I were going to criticize anything, it would be that I do wish that they would maybe take an extra step or two in some of these situations to at least provide some sort of visual evidence for us to extrapolate on. So, for example, I don't need a whole scene in The Rise of Skywalker of Rey. I don't need a John Williams scored montage scene of Rey fixing the X-Wing. Would I take it? Absolutely. I love ships, and I love Rey working on ships or flying ships. I think that's awesome. I don't need that. But would it have been so hard to simply CGI out a portion of one of the wings? Maybe not even the whole wing, just a portion of it, just to sort of as a nod to go, okay, for you keen observers, clearly there is a part of a wing missing, and you can extrapolate that Rey fixes it because it's there when she arrives on Exegol. Something like that, right? And you could do something similar with Kylo Ren's helmet. Maybe a little bit of dialogue in the scene where it's being reconstructed by the monkey guy as to the importance of it. Or, maybe when Kylo Ren's walking through a hall on the Star Destroyer when they return, and he's got the head of Bulio, right? And those two troopers go ghouls. Maybe a little explanation there. Again, and I'm kind of doing that thing that I criticize a lot, but I'm saying if I were going to suggest anything, I would suggest that the content creators just take that little extra step. Does it ruin the movie for me? No. Is it going to make me watch it any less? No. Just wants and desires, but I'm totally fine, too, that they're not in there because, as I've said before, this is a universe and storytelling where we bought into a lot of stuff a long time ago. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so it would really be hypocritical of me to go, oh, the movie was ruined, and nitpick it just because there's a handful of things in the film that they didn't take the time to just go and explain. It doesn't ruin anything for me. I'm cool with it. And I'm also cool with the fact that, with the novelization, for those of us that really want to know, now we have the headcanon. Now we have a further explanation of Palpatine if you needed it. Now you have a further explanation of Rey and the X-Wing if you needed it. And for the casual fans, it doesn't matter. All right, so let's shift gears briefly and wrap the show up on. We'll wrap the show up on this.
We have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So I remember going to the theater to see Infinity War, and this was roughly around the time of sort of Last Jedi and the year around Ready Player One and all this. And obviously Infinity War was a massive film. Endgame was a massive film. The Marvel Cinematic Universe side movies are always big popular films, right? And this weekend, I don't know exactly why, but I was like, you know what? I really want to sit down and watch Infinity War and Endgame. I hadn't watched them in a while. I really like Captain Marvel, by the way. Captain Marvel, just as a side note, has this real strange sort of space opera vibe to it that I dig. It's not a space opera. I would never classify it as that. But you do get this, the opening of the film on an alien planet and her going to what for her is an alien planet, and then you do get some space action in the movie, and she clearly has those powers that translate into space, and the end of the film, it has this very sort of space opera vibe that I dig about Captain Marvel. But was watching Infinity War, and I'm going to watch Endgame probably later on this evening. But I realized that, the popularity of these films and the job that the Russo brothers did with wrapping up this 10 years and these first opening phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I mean, they really did do a fantastic job. And I can't help but wonder if there was a level of bias and frustration from the movie-going audience because of starting off with The Last Jedi, because of what we'd gotten in Infinity War, right? When we're talking about, I know there's a portion of the fandom that doesn't like The Last Jedi for reasons that we've talked about ad nauseum on the show, and I won't get into that right now. I think a lot of casual fans were fine with The Last Jedi, but I also think that there was this example sitting out here of this massive franchise film, right? A franchise now that has grown to the level of popularity of Star Wars, if not almost overtaken it if we're going by box office numbers alone. And I can't help but wonder if there is sort of even a subconscious expectation from the movie-going audience of, oh man, I wish my Star Wars movie were as grandiose and big as this Marvel Cinematic Universe that we're getting now, right? It's almost like Star Wars got challenged and is challenged in the box office, and it ended up becoming challenging for the movie-going audience and Star Wars fans to see a franchise reach the level of popularity that Star Wars did, and I think for a lot of people, perhaps crafted a finale of a smaller timeline of films, but more films, right? Crafted a finale that completely landed for almost everybody. I like Last Jedi more than I like Infinity War and Endgame. I like The Rise of Skywalker more than I like Infinity War and Endgame. But I can also be objective and go, I like those movies more. That's my bag. That's what I'm into. But if we're talking about sort of the storytelling process, I think there's an argument to be made to say that when it comes to wrapping up a series, that Infinity War and Endgame perhaps did it better than The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker did. Maybe. I'm not going to land firm on making that comment simply because you're talking about two very specific different genres. And that's more to my point. If that happened, if people got this idea that they would have rather have wanted something along the lines of Infinity War and Endgame in their Star Wars finales, via episodes 8 and 9 versus Infinity War and Endgame, then I can see how people went into those movies, and certainly The Rise of Skywalker, after the massive success of Avengers Endgame, and wanting something on that level, and then not getting it, I could see why that would be disappointing to some individuals. I think that may have happened on a subconscious level. Because if you go back and listen to a lot of the complaints or at least I have, when you go back and listen to and read complaints about The Rise of Skywalker, there are a lot of correlations to what was done in those Avengers movies that wasn't done in The Rise of Skywalker. And I guess my argument against that would be, well, they're different movies. And if you can't compare Star Wars movies to the Avengers movies, but I do think that subconsciously a lot of people went and did that. Now, look, I don't have any evidence of this whatsoever. This is just a hot take based off of the release of these films and the success that both The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker had versus the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the end of that run of those phases with Infinity War and Endgame. Simply because they came around together, I couldn't help but wonder while watching Infinity War if this movie that I'm watching right now tainted individuals' expectations going into Star Wars, thinking they would get something more along this lines, and then they didn't. They got something that was more along the lines of Star Wars. Again, I could be completely wrong. It was just a thought that popped into my head watching Infinity War today, and I really was enjoying watching it. They really do a fantastic job wrapping that series up. But at the same time, that also is a very different series, and a different sort of brand of excitement and entertainment and action than we get in Star Wars. I do wish that The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker had been more successful in the box office, maybe if only to silence some of the more louder detractors of it, but it certainly is not going to take away my enjoyment of the film and my eagerness to get the digital copy and the physical copy of The Rise of Skywalker, because I just absolutely love that movie. It's grown on me a ton in the 16 times that I've seen it now, and at the moment is one of my favorite Star Wars films. I love the pacing of it. I love the action that we get, and it really does combine, in my opinion, what Rian Johnson did in that masterpiece of a film of The Last Jedi and what he did with Rey and Ben. J.J. Abrams really pulled it together and concluded that story in a fantastic way in The Rise of Skywalker. And I was not expecting that to happen. I'm so thankful we didn't get the Colin Trevorrow version, because it would have ruined that completely. I was really, really happy and thankful that at the end we got that finality to that story between these two dual protagonists, and J.J. Abrams was brave enough to go there with that amazing kiss and exchange at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. I think that whole movie is just fantastic to me, even with the embedded Star Wars ambiguity that we have, with answers that are being answers to questions we didn't get in the movie but are now in this Ray Carson novel. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for checking out the show. I appreciate it. As always, I'll promote my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. If you want to support my nerd world, then pick up a copy of EMBARK. It's an exciting mix of Fast and the Furious, Star Wars, Ready Player One, and the science fiction adventures in literature and in movies of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. EMBARK Book 1 and EMBARK Treasure in Darkness Book 2 are both available now in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Purchase of the ebook gets you a massive discount on the audiobook. EMBARK The Vanishing War Book 3 is coming this April 2020, so just next month. So now is the time to go and get your copy of Book 1 and Book 2 of the EMBARK series if you've already purchased the books and you enjoyed what you read. Go to Amazon.com and please leave me a positive review, especially of Treasure in Darkness. I need some more reviews on Treasure in Darkness. It hasn't been out nearly as long as Book 1, so I could really use some more positive reviews on Treasure in Darkness. If you've already purchased the books, then if you wouldn't mind, please go and purchase a copy for a friend. If you know somebody who reads and likes sci-fi, or as we heard from on the listener feedback show, a friend of the show, Severin, wrote this fantastic email after reading EMBARK, and I want to read you just a snippet of what Severin wrote me. And she said this: to anyone who hasn't tried these books yet, if you like a good slow burn romance, I recommend EMBARK Book 1. There's a very intriguing dynamic between the two main protagonists, Taft and Katha. And if you need to start a new obsession over a couple that isn't Reylo, you really should get in on the Taft the ship. That's Taft and Katha. I'm going to, let's see, I'm sorry, I wrapped up here. Can't wait to read the whole trilogy. I really hope you write more. I don't want to say goodbye to these characters. And I'm just now finishing up the first book. So, yeah, and to what I said on the listener feedback show and what I'll say here is, yes, there are going to be more stories. I'm actually in the middle of writing and more than halfway through with the first side story. So I'm actually treating the writing of my books like the Marvel MCU is and kind of what Lucasfilm was going to do. There's going to be saga stories that'll be told over multiple books, and that's what books 1, 2, and 3, and the third one comes out in March, are about. And then after book 3, there's going to be a book 4, which is going to be a side story connected to the stories surrounding it. So I don't want to give the title just yet because I'm still kind of working with a few titles, but it is going to be blank an EMBARK adventure. And then book 5 will kick off the next set of saga stories. So now's the time to get on board, support my nerd world, and go and pick up your copy of EMBARK Book 1 or Book 2. Get them ahead of the release of Book 3 next month, and you'll be all caught up. Again, at Amazon.com, search for EMBARK, and Jon Justice, you'll find them there, and I really, really would appreciate it. I appreciate you listening to the show either way every single week. I'll be back again next week for more listener feedback after I hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or again, leave a comment on YouTube. And then another full Star Wars show again next weekend. So have yourself a fantastic week, and I'll talk to you real soon. And thank you in advance for purchasing a copy for you or a friend of my EMBARK science fiction space opera series.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.